Here we are with our next lecture on the Normans, and this, believe it or not, is week 8. So we've come quite a long ways. We've spent a lot of time looking at pre-conquest Normandy and looking especially at William the Conqueror and all the institutions that he brought to Normandy. And then we spent last week looking more at the Norman Church and how that developed. This week we're going to really end our talk about the Normans in England, Normandy in England, well, not quite Normandy, but Normandy in England and the Anglo-Norman world, by looking at the sons of the conquerors and the other Anglo-Norman kings who built on the institutions that William the Conqueror set up. And one reason I took so long on those was to try to cover everything so that you could see what these sons are walking into as they in turn become dukes and kings of Normandy. And we're going to talk about the successor of William the Conqueror, who is King William Rufus, William II Rufus. And he is the second son of William the Conqueror. He became King of England, and Robert Curthose became Duke of Normandy, and Robert Curthose was the oldest son. And why that happened is very curious, why the inheritance happened that way. Here is William the Conqueror, and this is his seal, and we see it on both sides. We see him seated on his throne holding the orb of power, the orb of rule, and the sword by which he keeps the peace within the kingdom. And here he is as a warrior and a defender of the realm. And these are the images that the kings copied after his reign. I also wanted to show you, I showed you one of his charters last time. Here's another charter. This is his charter to London, and we might just zoom in on that a bit, so that you can see. Has this been working?
Yeah, the color is truly bizarre.
Color is bizarre. Okay, this happens to be black and white. This is white. Ooh, purple hands. Oh, okay, that's right.
Oh,
purple and green. All right. Okay, here is the charter of William the Conqueror. And is that okay? And this is his charter to London, which gave the rights of the city of London. And so this is the start of something that we see, an explosion of city building that was happening at the time after the Norman conquest, because we talked about all the building that was going on, the castle building and the church and cathedral building. Well, cities were blossoming everywhere as well. And so again, this is the same. Okay, this is actually in Old English. It's partly Latin and partly English. William King to William the Bishop. And I'm sorry, I don't read Anglo-Saxon, but this is an Anglo-Saxon charter. But it's very nice that I can show you an Anglo-Saxon charter. When William became king, the first charters he issued were in Old English or Anglo-Saxon, and then he began issuing Latin charters because his chancery would have been filled with Englishmen at first, and they would have written in Anglo-Saxon. I'm going to come back to some of these charters again later when we talk about the other children. And I thought it was kind of appropriate. I found this picture of 3 kings, and I have a nice close-up here of 3 kings dressed in English attire. This is an English manuscript, so we can get an idea of maybe what our kings looked like: William the Conqueror, William Rufus, and Henry, who were the next 3 Anglo-Norman kings. Okay, oops, I'm going to have to switch this to the other side. I'm sorry, I outsmarted myself here. All right. Robert Curthose, who was the eldest son of the Conqueror, inherited the Duchy of Normandy, and he was born probably in 1051 to 1052, and he died in 1134. He had a lot of brothers and sisters, and this is very normal in Norman times. Most families had 10 or more children, and so the women were very prolific. His brothers and sisters included Richard, who was born in 1055 and died somewhere in the period 1069 to 1074. Richard was killed in a hunting accident. I think he actually was riding his horse and smashed into a tree branch that knocked him off his horse. And so it's dangerous to be a knight in this time when you're hunting in the forest. William was the third son, and he was born between 1055 and 1060. And the third son was Henry, who was born between 11 May 1068 and 11 May 1069, and he died in 1135. I might mention that this is William Rufus, and he died in 1100, August 2nd, 1100. And there were 5 daughters, and there's some confusion about how many daughters William the Conqueror had. Agatha, Adelaide, Constance, Cecilia, and Adela. The one we know the most about is Adela, and we'll be mentioning her quite a bit more. Agatha is a little bit problematic. Some people think she's the same person as Adelaide. Adelaide was the oldest daughter, and she married very well. She married a Norman magnate. Cecilia, I don't know what happened to Constance, and Cecilia became the abbess of La Trinité, the abbey in the city of Caen. At age 13, in 1064, Robert Curthose was betrothed to Margaret of Maine by the young Count Herbert, who was the son of Count Herbert, who had died in 1062. And this marriage was made, it was actually brought about by the Count of Maine because he was in great danger of being overwhelmed by the Normans, and it was his way of making peace with the Normans and sort of surrendering to them without surrendering. What he did was hand over the duchy and his sister and her inheritance, which was the county of Maine, if he, the young Count Herbert, died without children. That seems to me like an invitation to do away with young Herbert. He did hang around for a while, but actually Robert Curthose did get control of the county of Maine. Yeah, question?
Another hunting accident?
No, it wasn't a hunting accident. We might ask, was it another poisoning? And it's quite possible that it was, but he disappeared fairly quickly. And Robert Curthose did get the county of Maine. I found this drawing of a Norman, and I thought it was kind of a nice one that showed you what Robert Curthose might have looked like. We don't actually have any pictures of what he did look like, but this is clearly a Norman in the kind of Norman clothing that Norman men would have had. And here is the county of England. Robert Curthose, of course, inherited Normandy, and William Rufus acquired all of England. Here is the county of Maine. Down here is the county of Maine off of this map. Let's see, right there. And of course, Brittany is included in that. So this is the Anglo-Norman realm. All right. Recall that Walter, Count of Pontoise, also claimed Maine in right of his wife Biota, and so there were various claimants to the county of Maine. And Biota was the daughter of Hugh, Count of Maine, and she was the paternal aunt of the young Count Herbert. And recall that Walter and Biota were poisoned, possibly by King William. When you read through Ulrich Vitalis, you see people being poisoned all the time. And a lot of women are doing the poisoning. For your midterm exam, right, you had the story of Mabel of Belem, and she was poisoning people right and left. She's a fairly typical Norman woman. She's a very interesting woman. Just send food to people, yes. And so poisoning was going on all the time. Margaret, the young wife of Robert Curthose, died, quote, while still a maiden in the guardianship of the Duke, to quote William of Jumièges. But later, I found in another source that Margaret had actually died in a nunnery, so something fishy was going on there, and I don't know that anyone has explained why she was in a nunnery if she was betrothed to Robert Curthose. So that's a very curious thing. There are lots of curious things going on among the aristocrats in Normandy. Yeah?
You sometimes hear about a queen that has a problem with the king running away to a nunnery.
Oh, a queen running away to a nunnery?
I'm recalling, I guess, in the legendary works about Arthur and the cycle of... I'm kind of recalling that. I'm wondering if that was one of the possible practice.
Actually, this is more true of Anglo-Saxon times. In Anglo-Saxon times, queens would often become abbesses of a nunnery, or they would run away to the nunnery, and in their old age, or even in their middle age, they would desert their husbands and seek a queenly role as an abbess, where they had a very powerful political position. That was true in Anglo-Saxon times. It was not true in Anglo-Norman times. After the conquest, Norman women didn't enter nunneries. They didn't want to be in nunneries. They wanted to be married, because the powerful the powerful women were the married women, and the abbesses were not powerful in Anglo-Norman times. And this is very strange. I mean, the customs changed. And remember, I told you that St. Anselm, who became the Archbishop of Canterbury, glorified married women. We've got a kind of echo here, Don. Can you hear it? Anyway, they glorified married women, and so the fulfilled woman was not seen as a religious woman. She was seen as a married woman who had children and raised them up to be famous and powerful, and helped her husband to be powerful. And that's the ideal woman in Anglo-Norman times. Well, Robert did homage to Count Geoffrey le Barbu, that means Geoffrey the Bearded, of Anjou for Maine, after Geoffrey granted the whole fief and Margaret to him. And so he was already Count of Maine, and that's why it's so strange and curious that poor Margaret was sent off to a nunnery. So he never married her. He didn't marry her. He was just betrothed to her. He got the county of Maine before he married her, and she ends up in a nunnery. Yeah.
He may have wanted to marry someone else, and that's how he's able to do it, by sending her off to a nunnery. The engagement is off, and now he's free to marry who he wants.
Well, this is just a guess. I mean, you know, it would have been very nice to marry the heiress of Maine, but what he did was kind of outwit the Counts of Anjou by not having to marry her. This meant, and you're right in a way, that he would still be available to marry someone else and make another political alliance. And so it would be advantageous to him not to be married, because he would still be available to make more political alliances. So that is absolutely true about the conditions in Normandy. At age 17, in the year 1068 to 1069, either he returned to Normandy from England with his mother, or possibly he stayed in Normandy. I've read two different accounts in the sources. So he could have remained in Normandy as one of the regents ruling Normandy, or he could have gone to England with his mother. And when his mother went to England, his mother's name was Matilda, and you've all discovered by now that all the queens of England are named Matilda. Okay. This Matilda, I call her Matilda of Flanders. The wife of William the Conqueror is Matilda of Flanders. At any rate, Henry I was born in England while his mother was there in 1098 or 1099, and then she came back to Normandy, where she and Robert ruled the duchy together, or perhaps William entrusted the duchy only to Robert. At age 17, he was regarded as an adult. And he was probably knighted at the age of 16, which is what it normally happens. In 1075, full Count of Anjou attacked Maine. We have another Count of Anjou now. The Counts of Anjou frequently fought each other. I mean, this is a rough and tumble age, and so we have a number of different Counts of Anjou who, as the power changed hands. In 1075 now, the new Count of Anjou attacked Maine, and A certain cardinal priest of the Roman Church and some holy monks intervened in a threatened battle between Fulk and King William. Who that cardinal priest of the Roman Church was, we don't know, but he sounds like a representative from the Pope. And so with some monastic cohorts. And so we see the Pope beginning to interfere once again in the governance of the Anglo-Norman state. Peace was made, and this is a common role for papal legates and also for priests and monks and bishops to be peacemakers and to be intermediaries and make peace. The treaty that was made was that Fulk recognized Robert as Count of Maine, quote, with the whole fief which he had received from Count Herbert when he was betrothed to Margaret, who now possibly was dead at this point. William of Jumièges says that she died a nun at Fécamp, and so if she was already dead at this point, or if she went into the nunnery, we don't know exactly what happened, but whatever happened to her, Robert got Maine. Afterwards, Robert did homage to Fulk as a vassal to his lord. And actually, here is, I was looking for a homage ceremony, but I couldn't find one. Here is a kind of nice scene of the making of a knight, so that a young man would go through this ceremony. He would be given his spurs, he would have his sword belted on him, he would have his armor put on him, and he would then do homage and fealty to his lord. And usually the lord would make him a knight. So at some point during all of these negotiations, Robert had become a knight. Peace was made between the king and the Count of Anjou, and Curthose was made Duke of Normandy just before 1066, and later when the king, William the Conqueror, when he was sick. William named his firstborn son Robert as his heir and ordered all the nobles to do homage and swear fealty to him, possibly about 1077, and this was a time when he was sick. And so now here I'm quoting the story according to William of Jumièges, and Orderic and William are full of just wonderful stories. I just had to write this story down for you and tell it and read it to you. It really shows what the sons of the Conqueror were like. But in his adolescence, after the death of his betrothed Margaret, Robert was moved by youthful ambition and the fatal advice of his comrades to ask his father for Maine and Normandy as honors that were rightly his. However, his prudent father, after considering all the circumstances, refused his request and persuaded his son to wait for a more opportune time to acquire them. Robert, as a young man, wanted his inheritance. He wanted to go on with his career. And this really is representative of the frustration that a lot of the young men in Normandy felt, because the fathers would hold on to the power for quite a long time. And actually, most of the sons would not come into their own until about the age of 35. And here he is in his 20s and wanting to have his power handed to him. And here is Normandy. Here is the territory he wanted, Normandy and Maine, from his father. He, however, this would be Robert, took offense because he could get nothing out of his father and arrogantly came to blows with him on a number of occasions. He was talkative and extravagant, reckless, very courageous in battle, a powerful and sure archer with a clear, cheerful voice and a fluent tongue. Round-faced, short, and stout, he was commonly nicknamed Fat Legs and Curthose. And other stories are told about him, and here is a sort of fool who was at the court, an entertainer, and Robert was reputed to have surrounded himself with sycophants and fawners who fawned after him, and jesters and musicians and entertainers, and so he was often cited as really loose with his money and really careless with his administration, very self-indulgent. That's the reputation that Robert Curthose had. And here's a story that kind of represents that. Once when the king was preparing an expedition against the men of the Corbonnais and was lodging in Gunner's house in Richard's town called L'Aigle, a fiendish dispute arose among the king's sons, which gave rise to many battles and outrages later. For two of the brothers, William Rufus and Henry, were on good terms with their father, and deeming their strength equal to that of their brother Robert, thought it shameful that he aimed at the whole inheritance and, surrounded by a swarm of obsequious sycophants, considered himself equal to his father. So we've got a little sibling rivalry going on here, and here is a castle that might be, this is the castle of Coucy, that might be like the castle at L'Aigle. And here is the story as it continues. So they came to the town of L'Aigle. This would be Robert and William. William Rufus and Henry came to the town of L'Aigle, where Robert had taken up residence in the house of Roger of Cauchos, and began to play dice in the upper galleries, as knights do. They made a great noise about it, and soon began to pour down water on Robert and his sycophants underneath. Then Ivo and Aubrey of Grandmesnil said to Robert, "Why do you put up with such insults? Just look at the way your brothers have climbed up above your head and are defiling you and us with filth to your shame." Well, what they were doing was peeing on them. Don't you see what this means? Even a blind man could. Unless you punish this insult without delay, it will be all over with you. You will never be able to hold up your head again. So we've got a little sibling rivalry going on. Hearing these words, Robert dashed to his feet in a towering rage and dashed to the upper room to take his brothers unawares. The noise issuing from his lodging quickly brought the king to the spot, and he patched up the quarrel for the time being. But on the next night, Robert and his followers deserted the king's army, hastened to Rouen, and attempted to seize the royal citadel by stealth. So what the brothers did was just goad Robert into making more foolish mistakes, and now he rebelled against his father. Well, when he got to Rouen and started to attack the castle, Roger of Ivry, the castellan of Rouen, got wind of it and saved the castle. And at this, Robert and his allies fled into exile. So they left Normandy. They had rebelled against his father. Hugh of Chateauneuf gave them shelter. He was a Frenchman outside of the borders of Normandy. Hugh himself was married to Mabel, the sister of Robert of Bellême. And this is the daughter of our Mabel of Bellême that we had on the exam. Yeah, this is her daughter. And this is her son, Robert of Bellême. And Robert of Bellême was notorious, a really horrible guy who tortured people and killed people, and he was really awful. Yeah.
This is the son that Mabel had brought to the Abbey one time.
Yes, this is her son. He was just as bad as she was. They're wonderful characters here. So Robert of Bellême and Ralph of Conche were also among the rebels, and Bellême was one of those frontier territories. It was on the boundaries of Normandy, and so those were the people who often rebelled. And this is one of the castles that we might think of as what the Norman castles looked like. King William then confiscated the lands of all these allies of the Bellêmes especially, and the Conches. And he confiscated their lands and used the revenues to hire mercenaries to fight against them, which was a very clever thing for William to do. Curthose and his allies then fled to Flanders, where they were received as friends. And why would they be received as friends in Flanders? Because the Count of Flanders was their grandfather. And if the new count was in there, it would have been his cousin. Queen Matilda may have sent him money, and in fact she did send under the table money to Robert against the wishes of William the Conqueror, and so she, as a good mother, supported her son even though he rebelled against her husband. Then Robert Curthose traveled to the court of King Philip of France, and he was received well. And so the King of France, who was very weak at this time, remember that the King of France only had a little bit of land around the city of Paris, and so he was looking at a way to disrupt this powerful duchy to the north, and so he fought together with Robert Curthose, and this is called the Rebellion of 1078. And in fact, King Philip of France and Robert Curthose actually defeated William the Conqueror at the Battle of Gerberoy. And this was a very curious battle, because Robert was allied with Philip of France, and they actually defeated and humiliated King William. And then Anselm, our Anselm, who was the abbot of Bec, or he was just at this point, Erlewine had just died, and so Anselm came at this point, and he was actually seeking from William his blessing for Anselm to become the abbot after Erlewine had died. And Anselm acted as a peacemaker, and he is the one who appears to have reconciled King William and King Philip, because the next thing you know, King Philip and King William are allied against Robert Curthose, and they together send him into exile. So there's a switching of sides going on there. And it looks like, we know Anselm was there because he witnessed a charter, and it looks like he was the one who was the peacemaker. And more than that, more than the fact that Robert had his ally taken over by King William made peace with Robert as well, and reinstated Robert as Duke of Normandy. So Anselm appears to have made peace between the father and the son. But difficulties between father and son continued. And here is a tomb of King Philip I, which has a kind of portrait of him. Maybe I should have turned it the other way so that you could see what he looked like. But this is his tomb that has his portrait on it. And here is a map of Europe at that time, and we can perhaps look at the areas that we're talking about. Here is Normandy, and the area of Paris. This is just the tiny little area around Paris that the King of France controlled, and Normandy was a huge power to the north. They had about 4 times as much land under their control as the King of France. Robert then went into exile. And I also wanted to point out where Flanders was. If you've forgotten, we know where Flanders is, right up here. This is Flanders right along here. Okay. Robert went into exile around 1083 to 5, and his mother died in 1083. Robert then had an affair in France, and the result was he had 2 sons and a daughter. And this brings up the fact of illegitimate children among the Normans. William the Conqueror was an illegitimate child himself. He was called William the Bastard. He himself did not have any illegitimate children that we know of. He seems not to have had any, but Robert followed the more typical pattern of the magnates, and he had 2 sons and a daughter. And one of the interesting things I found out, I don't know, I mean, somebody must know this. I haven't checked in the very old biography of Robert Curthose that was written in 1920, but he tried to marry Matilda of Tuscany, and this is extremely interesting to me because Matilda of Tuscany is an extremely important woman. She was a very powerful woman, a count in her own right in Tuscany, and she was the biggest defender of Pope Gregory the Great and all the Reformed popes. She was the only one who defended them with her army, and she helped with their elections, and she helped them defend themselves against the Holy Roman Emperor. So it was extremely important, and I have a picture of her that I'll show you later because she helped Anselm when he went to Rome. Do you have a question?
Yeah. I'm thinking that William, if he had used his son instead of not giving him any power, if it had used him as a governor or some sort, his power to the south would have been stronger, it seems like.
Yes, we might fault William the Conqueror for not maybe giving him Maine. If he had given him Maine, he could have held him off from rebelling at all this time. But then later, when Robert became Duke of Normandy, and ruled on his own, everybody saw how incompetent he was. He was an utterly incompetent duke. He frittered away all his money. He gave everything away. He lost everything. He was utterly foolish.
He had enthusiasm, but not real capabilities.
Enthusiasm, but no capabilities. Yeah, yeah. Well, he just wanted power and wealth. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. I was reading. Are these the two sons and the daughter that he claimed that weren't his? Or is this the only case where it's known that he had these? I was reading somewhere that someone came to his court later and presented two semi-grown sons.
Oh,
and
yes,
said,
yes, yes.
These are your sons, and he made her take a test or something, and then he recognized them after that.
Yeah, these are the sons. Yeah. So he did have sons and a daughter, but it was a concubine. He wouldn't have wanted to marry her. Matilda of Tuscany was probably the prize woman in all of Europe, and he thought he was the prize man, but she was wise enough. And Matilda of Tuscany is a whole different story altogether. I mean, she is an extraordinary, interesting person. I'm sorry I can't tell you more about her at this time, but I have a graduate student who's writing her master's thesis on Matilda, so maybe we'll get a story about her later. Well, in 1080, Malcolm of Scotland invaded England and he was defeated, and at this point he did homage to Robert Curthose. Now, this points to the idea that perhaps William was planning on making Robert Curthose king. If he had the King of Scotland do homage to him, it suggests that Curthose was going to be king. But when William the Conqueror died in 1087, he only gave Robert Normandy because Robert was in rebellion at that time. He was wandering around trying to marry Matilda of Tuscany. And so William forgave Robert on his deathbed because he was surrounded by priests, even though Robert wasn't there. And at that moment, Robert was in Ponthieu, which is just outside of Normandy, very close. It's not far from Rouen, and William the Conqueror was on his deathbed for quite a while. Robert did not come there. And so that is probably why his father gave England to William Rufus, because Robert was in Ponthieu with a lot of followers, and he didn't even attend his father's funeral. So you see how mad he was at his father. And this is Ypres in Flanders, which is the area where he was in that area around Ponthieu. His supporters in England, Robert's supporters in England, led by Eustace of Boulogne, seized Dover and other castles, but Robert, frolicking in Normandy, did not come to their aid, and they lost the castles. And he was fooling around when he could have gotten England if he had gone to the aid of his supporters. But Robert instead went to Normandy and started enjoying his rule. He did donate to churches for his father's soul, as his father had wished, and released some of his father's prisoners. And this was a very foolish thing for him to do, because the prisoners he released included Ulf, the illegitimate son of King Harold Godwin's son. And Ulf would be a contender for the throne of England. That was a really stupid thing for him to do. And also Duncan, he released Duncan, the son of King Malcolm of Scotland. And he entertained them and personally bestowed arms on them. In other words, he made them his knights. This light seems to shine in a funny way. Well, you can see it better on the monitor. Okay. He also released Duncan, son of King Malcolm of Scotland. Now, clearly, William the Conqueror was holding Duncan as a hostage to guarantee Malcolm of Scotland's good behavior. And this was really stupid, to let the hostages go. And Robert Curthose continued to do foolish things time after time. He entertained them personally and bestowed arms on them. And here is Dover Castle, which is where the invasion took place in England. And here is England, of course, with the invasion coming from Flanders, across from this area to Flanders to Dover, which is right across from Flanders there for the invasion. Robert's uncles, Odo of Bayeux and Robert of Mortain, urged him to invade England, and they returned to England. Rufus granted them their lands, but they repaid the king by betrayal. Nevertheless, Rufus defeated them, and they returned to Curthose's side in Normandy. Henry had inherited 5,000 pounds, and he purchased the Cotentin from Robert. And here is Robert making yet another foolish mistake, selling part of Normandy to his own brother. This is really a foolish thing to do. Meanwhile, Rufus seized a number of Norman castles in Normandy, including Fécamp and Eu, and so Robert was on the run at all sides. William, Count of Eu, and Stephen, Count of Aumale, helped Rufus, so all of the duchy was in rebellion. Robert and Rufus then joined together against Henry, and Robert, after having taken Henry's money, now seized the Cotentin and took it away from Henry, so he was duplicitous and dishonorable as well as incompetent. Rufus and Robert then besieged Henry at Mont Saint-Michel, and so poor Henry was left out in the cold once again. We saw that foretold by their childhood stories. And here is the area I wanted to show you. This is the Cotentin right here, which was sold to, which Robert sold to Henry and then took back. And here is Mont Saint-Michel right here where Henry held out. Henry escaped and held out at Domfront, and let me show you where Domfront is. Domfront is right there, so he went from Mont Saint-Michel to the castle of Domfront, and Domfront remained his ally ever after that. And neighbors of Domfront supported him. Helias of La Flèche married a granddaughter of Herbert, Count of Maine, and seized Maine at that point. And not until 1093 did Robert lead an army against him. So the whole duchy was falling apart, and now Robert had lost Maine. There was general chaos in Normandy. And Robert was saved by the bells, so to speak, because in 1095, Pope Urban II called the First Crusade at Clermont in France. Robert then was a good soldier. We saw by his description that he was a good archer. He decided to go on crusade, and what he did was pawn Normandy to Rufus for 10,000 silver marks. And when we get to see Rufus's character, you'll see that this was really a terrible mistake too, because Rufus was a shrewd, tough character, and if he had lived, Robert would never have gotten Normandy back. But he acquitted himself well on crusade, and he left the crusade a hero. He married Sybil of Conversano, the daughter of a Norman in Norman Italy, on his way home. She was the sister of William of Conversano, and it was a very good marriage, and he got a lot of money for the dowry that she had. And so here is, I couldn't find Urban calling the First Crusade, so here is St. Bernard actually calling the Second Crusade, so we can see the calling of the crusade. And here are some Crusader knights setting off on the crusade, and here is a map showing the way to the Holy Land, which would have been through Italy. Conversano is in this part of southern Italy, and here are the Crusader states. And Robert actually acquitted himself quite honorably in the battles to win the Crusader states. Sybil herself was a beautiful woman of excellent character and renowned for her wisdom. At times during the Duke's absence, she managed the private and public affairs of the duchy better than the Duke would have done had he been present. Okay, so she was smarter than her husband. I'm quoting William of Jumièges here. Their son, William Clito, was born in 1102, but unfortunately for everyone, Sybil died in 1103, and there was a rumor that she had been poisoned. Once again, poisoning is going on everywhere. William Clito was raised by the King of France, and so you can see that this is going to spell trouble for the other Normans who had control. Henry, meanwhile, allied himself with Rufus and regained the Cotentin and Bayeux, except for the cities of Bayeux and Caen, which Rufus kept control of. Rufus then built the castle at Gisors, which Henry fortified well, and this was a very important castle. Here is a Norman woman, or a medieval woman, who Sybil might have looked something like this. And here is our picture of a Norman knight who might have looked something like Robert Curthose. In 1100, in August, Rufus died, and Robert had returned from the Holy Land with Sybil to reclaim Normandy. And although he had the money, he did not repay that loan. He just took Normandy back and kept the money that he had gotten on crusade. He also claimed the right to England from Henry and invaded England with a large fleet. Henry negotiated a peaceful settlement and granted Robert 4,000 silver marks per year in perpetuity. In other words, a kind of pension of 4,000 silver marks, which was really a lot of money. So in 1101, Robert returned to Normandy, but he squandered his inheritance, and he squandered the money that Henry had given him. And now he gave away all his lands, he granted them out to people, and now he retained only Rouen in his demesne. In 1105, Henry crossed to Normandy and began his conquest in the Cotentin because he had a lot of allies there. He had held that land before. And so here again is the Cotentin, that area where Henry began his conquest, where he, right there is the Cotentin where he had held the land before. All right. In 1106 at the Battle of Tanchebray, and we'll talk about that in more detail later, but Curthose was captured and imprisoned by his brother Henry I, and he died in 1134 still in a luxurious prison. Henry took him and gave him a comfortable life in a castle, but he remained captive for the whole rest of his life, which was shrewd on the part of Henry I. Even though it was his brother, he didn't torture him, he didn't hurt him, didn't kill him, but he kept him locked up so he couldn't cause any trouble. Curthose is always assessed as a very poor Duke of Normandy, following Orderic Vitalis and William of Jumièges, and really no one has arisen to defend him and say he was good or talented or bright. The only good things people say about him is he was a pretty good warrior. He was good in battle, but his personal overindulgences, drink and women, he was too free with gifts of land and resources. He's painted as a fool manipulated by his barons. Worst of all, he failed to protect the Norman church from baronial encroachments, and this is the justification Henry used to conquer England. He said, I am going to protect the church because Robert Curthose is not governing wisely nor well, and he is not protecting the safety of the church. He had one known illegitimate daughter married Helias, son of Lambert of Saint-Saëns, and receives Arques as her dowry. And here is Normandy as Robert Curthose let it fall into rack and ruin. Okay. William Rufus was the second son of William the Conqueror, and it's rather strange that he inherited England, because you would think that England was better than Normandy. It certainly was richer. It was better to be a king than a duke. Why did William inherit England? And a lot of historians will say, well, this is the pattern of Norman inheritance, that the father will give to the firstborn son the patrimony, which is the land the father inherited himself, and he will give to the secondborn son the conquered lands, which would have been England in this case, and then he will give to, and then the thirdborn son will be expected to take a career in the church and go into a monastery or be a bishop. And so the third son was usually educated. I think this has to have some revision, that version of the story needs to be reconsidered. It's almost an accident that this happens, and largely I think it's because Robert Curthose was so rebellious that William gave England to William Rufus. The greater prize went to the loyal son. He was made King of England in 1087 on the Conqueror's deathbed because the Conqueror was at odds with Curthose, or was it a pattern of inheritance? It's only a pattern of inheritance if you look at all the children, and I don't see the pattern there. I mean, I see the fathers dividing the sons among their children, and the pattern doesn't hold true with all the sons of all the Norman conquerors. Anyway, that's a minor point. Whatever the case, there were civil wars in Normandy in England in 1088, as we've already seen. Rufus, in order to defend England, apparently swore an oath to protect the church at Lanfranc's urging. He did go around swearing oaths to say that he would protect the rights of all the English people and the rights of the church, and so all the English rallied to his support. And the people who supported Robert Curthose were largely Normans who were on his side, and Normans who held in England as well as Normans who held in Normandy. William Rufus has had really bad press from medieval chroniclers, especially Eadmer of Canterbury, but also Orderic and Vitalis and William of Jumièges. They paint him as a terrible king, as an atheist or an agnostic at best. He's not a Christian. He loved Jews, he favored the Jews, and he wouldn't let them convert to Christianity. Why would he want the Jews? Because they were good businessmen. They were the only people who could loan money at interest, and they financed the growth of business. The growth of cities was happening around the financial obligations and business of the Jews. And so he protected his Jews. He valued them. But the Christian church then painted him as a kind of heretic. This isn't the only thing he did. What he did was to go against Anselm of Canterbury, and Eadmer was Anselm's secretary, and Eadmer is the one who is primarily responsible for all the bad press, although the other chroniclers also. William of Malmesbury talks about what a bad king William Rufus is. The sources all agree, but the sources are all written by churchmen. Here is the seal of William Rufus. He's called William Rufus. It means William the Red, probably because he either had red hair or a red face, whichever. But it's common to nickname. They're just like the Vikings. You know, they give nicknames according to personal characteristics or whatever they do. But he was called William Rufus or Guillaume le Roux. And here he is shown as a warrior on his shield. And he was a wonderful warrior. And here is a representation of civil war going on. I thought this was a pretty good picture to represent civil war. William of Jumièges said, "These and similar facts I could truly record of him, were it not deemed right to pass quickly over his deeds, merely for the sake of historical record, since he persecuted many servants of God and the Holy Church, for which, as wise men say, he did penance too late and fruitlessly. We prefer to pass on and expound more at length the deeds of Henry of divine memory, his brother and successor, who is greatly admired because of his protection and support of men of religion and the Church of God." So largely what they're criticizing William Rufus for is the fact that he did not do what Anselm told him to do. That's what it boils down to. Eadmer wrote his Historia Novorum, which I think might have been a kind of secret history that told blow by blow what happened between Anselm and William Rufus. Only one manuscript survives, plus a very abbreviated copy at one of the daughter houses of Canterbury. And when only one manuscript survives, and I believe it's the autograph manuscript, that means nobody copied it and it didn't circulate. And so it may mean that it's a secret history that was there for the instruction of the monks of Canterbury to show how an archbishop should act, and that's largely what Eadmer says. And Anselm wrote his letters, which are very business-like letters. They have to do with all of the business of running the archbishopric, and I've argued that Anselm collected his own letters, and the very extraordinary thing is that we know that he wrote some letters to William Rufus, and we know some existed, and huge numbers of them did not appear in the correspondence. He left them out. He deliberately eliminated. There are 4 times as many letters in the reign of King Henry as there are in the reign of William Rufus. And so something interesting is going on there. That I think the whole story has not been told yet on William Rufus, and to follow the chroniclers without criticism is a big mistake on William Rufus. In 1089, Rufus died, and I want to show you there is a modern biography of William Rufus. This is by Frank Barlow, and here's a picture of William Rufus holding the church that he built. It's not a church, I'm sorry. This picture is of William Rufus, and it comes from a picture that shows all 4 of the Anglo-Norman kings, each one holding the church that they each built. This one of William Rufus shows him holding Westminster Hall, which is a royal palace, not a church. He built churches, but they don't show him holding one. Again, I think this is that part of that propaganda against William Rufus, but he doesn't look like that bad a guy in this picture. Anyway, the book is by Frank Barlow, and it is a massive biography, and I find it quite frustrating. Barlow argues that William Rufus was very chivalrous, that he was a very chivalrous knight, and he had the honor of a warrior. Other than that, he tends to follow the assessments of the chroniclers, and I think that there is room to write another history of William Rufus that would be a little bit more accurate. On William Rufus? Actually, one of my students is working on the children of William the Conqueror, all 3 as a group, which is going to be a very interesting study, I think, and give us some new insights about them. Well, in 1089, when Lanfranc died, Rufus began confiscating church lands and leaving offices vacant. And he was greedy. I mean, he did this to collect all the money that the church lands would have collected for their bishops or their abbots if they had filled the office. In 1091, Malcolm of Scotland invaded England, and Rufus subdued him, and then he received his homage. The treaty repeated the terms of 1072, but now Malcolm did homage to Rufus, sort of negating the homage he had done to Curthose. Yeah. Oh, zoom out. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. Thanks. Okay. All right. And so William Rufus, according to the chronicles, he spent most of his time fighting wars, trying to conquer Normandy, trying to conquer Scotland, trying to conquer Wales. He was conquering everything. And this is true. But there are also a lot of administrative reforms that William Rufus made, and he is very interesting. And one thing about him is that he issued a whole lot of documents, and I'm going to try to show you some of his documents. These are facsimiles of William Rufus's documents. In the first place, the number of documents under William Rufus increased enormously over those of William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror issued huge amounts of documents. William Rufus was king for a much shorter length of time. But proportionally, he still issued quite a number of documents. And in these facsimiles, I have, if I can find William Rufus's, they're all Henry I. Okay, yes. Here is a grant by William Rufus to Battle Abbey in England. Okay, I'm going to try to put it, these are facsimiles, they're photographs of actual documents, and we can kind of read that a little bit. William, by the grace of God, King of the English, to Osmond, Bishop of Salisbury, and to all his barons and faithful men, French and English, of Wiltshire, greetings. Know that I have conceded to the aforesaid parish, and to have given to the Church of St. Martin of Battle and this would have been Battle Abbey that William the Conqueror had founded, and to the monks serving there. The manor, which is called, looks like Brombia, with all its appurtenances, and then he goes on to list a bunch of other gifts that he's giving to the monastery. And then we can notice this is a very typical charter, very much more complicated and complex than the charters issued by William the Conqueror. It's longer, it's larger, it has a longer witness list, and you can see it's more typical of the Norman charters. Okay, here are the witnesses. Let's see. Oh, here are the testaments. Udo Dapper, and so he kept the same household that William the Conqueror had and kept the same kind of household. Udo Dapper, who had been served in William the Conqueror's, Roger by God, Gilbert, son of Richard, that would be Gilbert Fitzrichard, done at Winton, this would have been Winchester. And so this is a typical charter. I think there's another one by William Rufus, unless we just jump to Henry I's charters, unless there's one here. This is a really good charter. No, we've only got one by William Rufus. Okay. There are lots of charters by Henry I, and we'll look at some of those a little bit later. But if you study the administrative changes made in England under William Rufus, you see that the administration has been built significantly, and that he has carried on in the tradition of his father, building a more complex bureaucracy and administration. In 1093, Anselm became Archbishop of Canterbury, largely because Anselm had pressured Rufus. Anselm had campaigned to be archbishop, and he had rallied all the magnates of England around him. William Rufus fell very ill and thought he was going to die, and it was only on his sickbed that he promised to make Anselm the Archbishop of Canterbury. Anselm immediately said, I've already recognized the Pope in England. I've already recognized the Pope in Normandy. It's going to be, of the two popes that are claiming it, I recognize Pope Urban. Rufus replied, "Oh, you are stealing the jewel of my sovereignty by claiming the right to recognize the Pope. Only the king has the right to recognize the Pope." And so Anselm and Rufus started off on the very bad terms with each other. Here is a bishop that we might think of as Anselm. Here is an English bishop who represents what a bishop would do in England. And of course, remember that Anselm was a monk as well from the monastery of Bec, and he had run the school of Bec, which had stressed reform and administration, which he brought to England to the reform of the church. And this is Canterbury, which was the mother of all churches of England and the head of the English church. If you'll recall from last time, this is a plan of Canterbury, what it looked like. Morrill, the nephew of Robert de Mowbray, Earl of Northumbria, killed Malcolm and his son and their whole army. And Robert of Mowbray was then imprisoned by Rufus for illegal seizure of castles. And again, we see this wild and woolly character of Rufus and all the men around him, seizing castles, going to war. Robert of Mowbray forfeited his inheritance, and Rufus threw him into prison for 20 or 30 years because he didn't die until 20 or 30 years later under Henry I. In 1095, we have the famous trial at Rockingham, which Eadmer describes in very great detail. The Rufus and the bishops were pitted against Anselm and the barons, and what they were arguing about was who would recognize the Pope. and who would have the right to name who would be the Pope in England. Would it be the Reformed Pope Urban II, or would it be the Pope chosen by the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany? Rufus just simply wanted the right to be the one to name the Pope. Anselm insisted that it had to be Urban, and they argued at great length, and finally Anselm claimed the right to go to Rome to consult with the Pope, and Rufus forbade him to go and said, "You cannot go to Rome without my permission, and if you go, you will lose your archbishopric." It ended with a stalemate, and what they did was argue to a standstill, and then Rufus declared a truce. They ended with a truce, and Rufus surreptitiously sent messengers to Rome. And Urban was in such a shaky position at the time that Urban did something very foolish. Urban gave to William Rufus's messengers the pallium, and with the pallium the right for Rufus to confer it on Anselm. And what this would mean would be the king had the right to confer power on the archbishop. Well, Anselm once again argued him to a standstill, and in the end, Rufus agreed to place the pallium on the altar of Canterbury Cathedral, and Anselm would receive it as if from the hand of the Pope. So Anselm actually won that argument. Yeah.
Why was that foolish of the Pope?
Because it gave up a right that he shouldn't have given up. He sort of undermined Anselm by doing that. Well, because Anselm was the foremost, he was the head of the English church. That's not going to make Anselm too friendly toward Urban. He's not going to trust him. Yeah.
So Lanfranc had actually won that position for the church, and here the Pope is losing it.
Yes, and Lanfranc had not necessarily won it, but he had established that position of king and archbishop working together. And now Anselm is having to work with a king who wants to make Anselm inferior to him. And so Anselm fought like mad to try to get that. And so here is the English realm that Anselm actually claimed to rule: England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland and the Orkneys above Scotland. That's what Anselm claimed to rule. And here is a court of justice that it's a later thing, but you can see how a court would have been set up where they would have argued the case at law. It was actually a court at law that is a wonderful description. There aren't very many descriptions of real court trials, and this is one. Well, then, after this happened, Rufus invaded Normandy without Anselm's blessing, and he failed to take Normandy. And everybody, of course, said, "Oh, well, God is on Anselm's side, and Rufus is not obeying Anselm." Anselm hinted at that point that Rufus was homosexual. Not necessarily that Rufus himself was homosexual, but that men at his court were. And at that time, that was a very terrible thing to accuse a king of, because it would have been the worst thing that a king would be. A king has to have children to have heirs. A king has to marry. And so I don't, Frank Barlow thinks that William Rufus was a homosexual. And I don't think he was. I don't think that the arguments for him being homosexual were that he never married and that he had no illegitimate children. On the other hand, it appears that Rufus tried to marry Matilda, the daughter of Malcolm of Scotland, and she was age 13 at the time. She was in school at the Abbey of Wilton. Her Aunt Christina was teaching her. And what her Aunt Christina did was to put a veil on her head and claim that she was a nun and that Rufus was trying to kidnap her. And so he went away. I mean, he just went away peacefully. But Rufus was at age 35 at the age when he should have married. And the fact that he didn't marry is simply because he died very young before he had a chance to marry. He should have married as king, and I think he tried to marry Matilda of Scotland. Anselm appears to have protected Rufus from a marriage alliance between Gunhilda, daughter of King Harold, and first Alan the Red and then Alan the Black. There exist these two letters in Anselm's correspondence in which he ruthlessly castigated Gunhilda, this poor daughter of King Harold, who tried to marry Alan the Red. She tried to escape the nunnery that she was living in, and Anselm ordered her back into the nunnery. Then Alan the Red died, and she married his brother, who inherited the earldom of Richmond, and she tried to marry him, and Anselm really stomped on her and just ordered her back to the nunnery in just no uncertain terms, in very harsh language. And the thing is, I think he did it for political reasons. Here is the I think you're going to have trouble reading this, but here is the genealogy of Gunhilda, the daughter of King Harold Godwinson of England. She was the daughter of a king. If Alan the Red, Lord of Richmond, I think she actually married Alan the Red, and she tried to then marry Alan the Black, but they were the lords of Richmond, and she was descended from an actual king of England. And so they would have a claim to the English throne, and this could represent a grave danger to William Rufus because the lords of Richmond is up here on the border of Scotland, and they could potentially form an alliance with the rebellious lords of Northampton here, and with the King of Scotland, and the King of Scotland was always invading this area, and this would be a serious challenge to the rule of William Rufus, because she was of a royal line. Even though the Normans thought it was illegitimate, all the Anglo-Saxons didn't think that was an illegitimate line. Well, remember that we talked about William Rufus taking Normandy from Robert Curthose. In 1096, Curthose pawned it to Rufus, and in 1097 Rufus came back from Normandy and he invaded Wales twice and failed to take it. Then at that point he was totally out of control. He had Normandy, he was about to conquer Wales, he had control over Scotland. Anselm had no leverage at all against him. William Rufus came and ordered Anselm to do everything he wanted and to submit to him. Rufus refused. He then claimed the right to go see the Pope. Rufus said, if you leave England, you will forfeit your archbishopric and all your money and all your income. Anselm then went to Rome to consult with the Pope, and at that point, he was utterly helpless because the Pope didn't want him. I mean, the Pope wasn't going to defend him. When he got to Rome, the Pope did not support him. Anselm was really left bewildered and unsupported. Meanwhile, William Rufus in 1098 started waging war on the continent, and he reconquered Maine and Brittany and bragged that he would be in Paris the next year. He was aiming to conquer all of the continental domains of the French and everybody else around them. At the same time, and we know this through Eadmer, he was writing to Roger, the Count of Sicily and Italy, and proposed an alliance with him. Well, this would have been absolutely disastrous for the Pope if William Rufus in England allied against Pope Urban and joined together with Roger of Sicily and Italy and with the German Emperor. The Pope would be utterly surrounded and in big trouble all over Europe. Under that kind of pressure, it's clear from Eadmer that Urban granted legatine privileges to Count Roger and primatial rights to the Archbishop of Salerno, and the right of Roger, Count Roger, to control the whole Church of Sicily and Italy. Now, this is something Anselm had claimed, and I mean, it's what William Rufus was claiming. It's what William Rufus was claiming, the right that he had to over the church in England. And Urban just granted it to Roger. to get Roger's alliance. He desperately needed Roger at that time. Anselm had met with Urban in Italy at the Council of Bari, and Anselm must have talked with him and tried to reconcile what was going on. And here we can see in this map what would have been happening here. Anselm had spent his exile here in Burgundy, and then he went through Tuscany here to Rome, and they met on the plains of Bari down here. But Roger, Count of Sicily, controlled Sicily and all of southern Italy. The German emperor controlled this area, and William Rufus, of course, controlled most of northern France and all of England. With that kind of an alliance together, the Pope would be in terrible trouble. And here is a royal procession to recall what William Rufus was doing, building his power. In 1099, Anselm was in exile in Burgundy in Lyon, apparently with no hope whatsoever of returning to England. In the summer of 1099, on 15 July, the Crusaders took Jerusalem, and this utterly transformed the political situation in Europe. Now the Pope was no longer helpless. Now he had control over the propaganda that would assure the success of the reformed popes. But sadly for Pope Urban II, who was the genius who conceived of calling the crusade, he died before he ever found out that Jerusalem had fallen. He died on 19 July, and strangely enough, on the 2nd of August, 1100, just a year later, William Rufus died in a hunting accident in the New Forest. C. Warren Hollister argued at great length that this was only an accident. Okay, William Rufus, if it wasn't an accident, it was actually one of the vassals of Saint Anselm who shot him. And if it wasn't an accident, if it was a murder, the person who would have been accused of it would have been Henry I. And of course, Warren Hollister wrote the biography of Henry I, and he didn't want to see Henry I as a murderer. I have argued that Walter Tyrrell, who was the bowman who shot the fatal arrow, I have argued that he was actually one of the vassals of the Abbey of Bec and a good friend of Anselm's. I don't think Anselm was behind the plot to kill William Rufus. I think it was a group of churchmen, and I think the church was behind it. I don't think they ordered the killing, but I think the environment was such that everybody knew that if Rufus died, it would be to the benefit of the church. I don't think it was a plot, but I do think it was a murder. And I've argued that in print, and hardly anybody agrees with me, but that's what I've argued. Well, Rufus ruled some 13 years, from 1087 to 1100, and I really believe there's much to be done on his reign, and much depends on how we read Eadmer. William of Malmesbury more or less repeats Eadmer. Rufus has been accused of atheism, witchcraft, loving Jews, hating Christians. As I said, he did protect the Jews of Rouen. He prevented forced conversion of Jews. Frank Barlow calls him very chivalrous, and Emma Mason is writing a new biography, and I think he needs to be redone, to tell you the truth. Yeah, did you have a question?
It seems like William Rufus was quite a strong king, and Urban probably saw that, and he saw that allying with the Mediterranean power, the other Normans would be the way to go.
Yes, I think William Rufus was a very smart man. He was very shrewd. He got all the bad press and the black reputation because he didn't support the church. And now Warren Hollister and I studied with Warren Hollister. We used to argue about this all the time, and Warren said, Well, he wasn't very smart not to support the church, because you shouldn't make an enemy. You shouldn't make such a major enemy of the church. I think that Rufus, maybe he wasn't as smart as Henry I, but then Henry I had the advantage of Rufus's bad example to follow, and Henry I mended fences. He didn't make any of the mistakes William Rufus did, but he did a lot of the good things William Rufus did administratively. Yeah.
It seems like the church itself is changing character, where it's competing for imperial power, and a strong king who is not necessarily church friendly is not the right kind of king. So bad press can be quite understandable in this case, and even a possible murder of the king.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's perfectly, I mean, when you read the sources on that death, and they say, William Rufus has come up before the court of God and the justice of God, and they predicted that he would die the next day. I mean, there are all these predictions that he was going to die, and everybody knew about it. Anselm was already on his way back to England before he even died. I mean, it just, the evidence is so overwhelming to me that the church, that somebody in the church knew that the death was going to happen. Well, let's save our questions until after the break, because it's time to go on our break for about a 15-minute break, and we'll take this up again when we come back. Okay? All right.